Well, thanks again for doing this, Matt. So the first question is just to orient people to to whom they are listening. So, in just a few sentences, and again for this general audience, could you state your name and then tell visitors, about your expertise?
My name is Matthew Kirschenbaum, and my title is Distinguished University Professor of English at the University of Maryland. I've spent my whole career really studying the history and the impact of different kinds of writing technologies, from letterpress type to word processors, and the impact of how these media and technologies change how we think and communicate. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wondered if writing machines, like the experimental typewriter he began using when his eyesight started failing late in his life, he wondered if writing machines would change not only how we write, but what we think and what we do write. And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. Our technologies do affect our thinking. In March of 2022, I published an article in the Atlantic magazine on new AI technologies like ChatGPT that I called Text Apocalypse.
Thank you. Um, Maybe we could have you talk now about, how you became interested in today's chatbots and large language models.
Well, given everything I've just said, how could I not be interested? People might think it's strange that an English professor like me is interested in things like word processors, let alone artificial intelligence. But really, these are technologies that get at the big questions. How do we interpret a text that we know was written by a machine? Can a machine have intentions? Can it want to mean something with its writing the way that human authors do? Can a machine ever mean anything? Would it make a difference to you if you knew that the novel you had just downloaded to your Kindle had been written by a computer? These are increasingly becoming everyday practical realities. And questions like that, I think, are too important to be left to computer scientists.
So what are you, asking yourself these questions that you just mentioned, where are you, how is your thinking about those developing?
Yeah. Well, in my field, in my corner of the world, it's a really interesting moment because people really are going back to first principles and those big philosophical questions. There are some viewpoints that suggest we should no more ascribe meaning or intention to anything written by a computer than we would to wavy lines on the seashore that we might stumble across. And like pictures in a cloud, just because a shape resembles something doesn't mean that it is that thing. The same, some argue, with computer generated writing. A machine can never do anything except process symbols and unthinkingly reproduce and imitate. Other people have different answers, in some ways, more pragmatic answers. The reality is, a lot of what we see on a day to day basis is probably nowadays machine authored. And we can't live our lives without taking a text like that seriously, a traffic summons that you might get in the mail. I'm a law abiding citizen and I pay my tickets, even though I know that the whole process was algorithmically generated, from the speed camera that took the original photo to the judgment that I was over the limit to generating the document that was mailed to me for my remittance. And so we live in a world where computers are authors, and I think we have to take that seriously.
Have you given thought about the major ways in which a computer differs as an author from a traditional human author?
Sure. I mean, we could get into the sort of technical aspects of how some of these language models work, but Another interesting way of coming at the question would be to ask whether they are so different. And so we know now, for example, that language models are trained on large bodies, large corpora of texts that are scraped from the internet and other sources. These training sets often include novels and fiction, and how different is that, we might ask, from the advice given to every aspiring author that I've ever heard, which is that before you become a writer, you have to be a reader. You have to read voraciously. You have to read everything and absorb and assimilate and allow other people's voices and technique to become part of your own. And so, as I said, these are some of the big questions that we've asked for a long time in literary studies, and here they are in a whole new format for us.
Well, um, how do you think that these contemporary technologies that we've been talking about, large language models and chatbots based upon them, how do you see these technologies fitting into kind of this long history of writing?
Mhm. So there are similarities and there are differences. In a lot of ways, what we're seeing right now is very familiar. Plato famously is on record against the idea of writing itself. He thought it would make people lazy. They wouldn't have to remember things anymore. They could just look them up in an artificial medium. Of course, the only reason we know what Plato had to say, of course, is that it was written down. More recently, word processors, which I've previously written a book about, word processing spawned many of the same anxieties as chatbots in the 1980s when personal computers and word processors first came on the market. Some authors would hide the fact that they were using them from their editors and agents because they thought people would suspect that a computer had written the book.
Um, and and does the importance what about the importance of these technologies today, like large language models and chatbots using them? How does their importance to kind of language and writing differ from other computing technologies, just like the case you were talking about?
Yeah.
What distinguishes these from something like word processing?
Sure. I think so for all of the similarities and continuities, I also think there are very important differences. A few months back on social media, I saw a picture of Neil Gaiman, the best-selling fantasy author, walking a picket line as part of the Writers Guild of America strike. And one of the key issues in that strike were the rights of authors in the age of AI, the right to be credited and crucially paid for their work, to not have their work used as part of the training data for the language models that might eventually replace them. So this was Neil Gaiman protesting in part to safeguard his art, but also his livelihood from a machine. And that was a wake-up call. I never thought I might see that in my lifetime. What language models actually do best, though, is not imaginative fiction, but the kind of mundane workaday writing that so many of us actually do. So, reports, memos, emails, routine internet content, even academic articles. A lot of jobs are potentially at stake.
Thank you. And could you briefly express your concerns about the text apocalypse to a general public visitor?
So, textpocalypse is a dramatic name that I've given to a future scenario in which writing becomes fully dissociated from the outcome of a human centered activity. The essential elements or steps to the text apocalypse are these: that text generated by language models becomes widely disseminated on the open internet. And in fact, we've already started to see that happening. Uh, the next step is that future generations of language models are then trained on the text of prior generations of language models from what's on the internet. And we've started to see that happen as well. That's a documented phenomenon in the technical literature. Once language models begin responding to prompts from other language models, then you have a complete cycle. And one outcome for the web might be something like the gray goo scenario in theoretical physics, where this is a scenario that physicists talk about, where nanomachines begin reproducing spontaneously and unstoppably to rearrange the molecular structure of all of the physical matter that surrounds us, changing our world from the carefully crafted environment that it is to a giant pile of gray sludge. And that too, in some ways, has begun to happen on the internet. There's been a lot of recent concern, for example, about the accuracy and integrity and usefulness of Google search results, as results from the big search engines like Google and Bing are starting to be integrated with the language models that are also being utilized by those same companies.
Wow. What I've heard some people using the phrase, this is again off the script that I said, but I've heard people using to distinguish the kind of writing that chatbots are doing today, calling it synthetic text. What do you think about that concept of using that phrase synthetic text to describe the
Mhm.
what these systems produce?
I think it's a useful phrase, but only insofar as we remember that all text is really synthetic. There's no technology that we've ever devised as a species that somehow is capable of capturing the raw, unmediated thoughts of our creative minds. Everything we do is filtered through a process. First, language, which many people have argued is itself a technology, but then in more literal and material terms, different kinds of writing instruments. This gets back to Nietzsche's question about whether our writing tools change the way we think. I believe, again, that they do. We write differently with a crayon or with a marker on a dry erase board than we do at our keyboards. We write differently at our laptop keyboard than we do on our phone. So all text, to some extent, is synthetic. And that is another aspect of the history of word processing that I think is relevant here too, because the immediate precursors of things like GPT are spell check, grammar models, other onboard technologies in our writing software that we take for granted, but which in fact are shaping our prose at a very literal and direct level. So those two would be examples of synthetic text.
Awesome. Um, no, being in the university, how are you seeing today's chatbots and large language models and systems around those? How do you see them affecting education?
Right, that's a big question. There are a lot of people certainly worried about what really comes down to students cheating on their homework. In other words, using tools like ChatGPT to write term papers and exams, for example. I'm not personally so concerned about that. The reality is that these technologies are going to be parts of the lives and careers that our students go on to lead. And I believe that as educators, we have a responsibility to teach them to become critical thoughtful and responsible users of them. I'm a lot more concerned about what happens when commercial and even political influences begin mingling with these technologies in the classroom. Arizona State University, for example, recently announced that it was partnering with OpenAI to produce its own uniquely branded language models for their exclusive campus-wide use. Now, that may be okay for ASU, but what happens when it's the New College of Florida doing the same? The New College of Florida was recently taken over by right-wing conservatives. And so what kinds of language models with built-in biases and points of view might it devise and craft for the use of its student body? Those are the kinds of questions that concern me more than the cheating on their homework question.
And what, if anything, excites you about the use of these language models and chatbots for creative pursuits, especially in the domain of writing or in the digital humanities?
Mm-hmm. So, people have been experimenting with computers to write fiction and poetry, what we sometimes call text generators, since the 1950s. We know, as a matter of the historical record, that that's when the first instances of people using what at the time were very large mainframe computers to generate text for creative purposes, specifically love letters in the case that I'm thinking of. That's a practice that goes back to the 1950s. We know the first chatbot, Eliza, dates to the 1960s. So there's a long history here already. Paradoxically, I think as the output of language models becomes more and more convincing, which is to say, more and more lifelike, I wonder if they'll become less interesting to us from a creative standpoint. It's the weird part of what happens when you ask a computer to write a poem that's always been interesting to me. The uncanny valley, if you will. And once we leave that uncanny valley behind, we'll just have a lot more fiction and poetry in the world, and it may not be especially good or especially interesting. It'll just kind of be there as more content to consume. And so that's a trend that I'm very interested in just watching to see how it shakes out.
Great. And if you wanted if you wanted a visitor coming to our exhibit to walk away kind of like with one key thing to kind of take with them and think about in the connection between today's chatbots and writing,
Hmm.
what would you really want them to kind of walk away with?
I think one of the big issues here, and this is part of the textpocalypse scenario, is that our writing is also our data. We tend to think of writing as a kind of surrogate for human speech, which of course it is, but writing in a digital format is also text, which is to say that it's a computationally usable data type. And apart from numbers, plain text, letters, words, sentences, computers have been very, very good at working with plain text. It can be parsed and analyzed and mined and otherwise used for purposes that you, as the author, might never have intended. We know that everything that you enter into a chatbot is recorded. It may be used as training data for those future iterations of the model. There have been reports of personal information like social security numbers and home addresses surfacing in some models' outputs. Beyond that, though, the reality is that our writing is no longer our own, and in some ways, it's arguably not even writing anymore. It's content, which is to say, targets for algorithmic advertising, and data to be analyzed and exploited. We push the textpocalypse a little bit further along every time we write something online. And it always reminds me a little bit of the scene in the original Ghostbusters movie when the Dan Aykroyd character summons the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And in the end, we're doomed by the thing that we love most. Not a comet, not a pathogen or nuclear war, but perhaps in the end, after all, by text.
Wow. And
So,
I mean, do you think I'm going to add one additional
mhm,
question, if I may, just about, I've heard some people advancing the argument that amidst all this kind of text that's generated by these systems, that in a world where this is happening more and more, that this will kind of uh, increase the value of for text written
mhm,
differently by people.
yeah.
And I wonder what you think about that, and also how would it be possible to differentiate between a human writer and a machine writer?
Mhm.
Anyway, I just wondered what you thought of those.
Yeah, so when I'm not pondering the textpocalypse, something else I do is I set old school letterpress type, wood type, metal type by hand for printing. And that's a practice that used to be commonplace. It was the fundamental technology of print production. Nowadays, you see it mostly used for things like wedding invitations when people want to signal or convey or communicate care, thoughtfulness, and intent. And I sometimes catch myself wondering whether human writing at large, in just the ways that you're describing, will essentially become like letterpress printing, a kind of craft boutique practice that endures, but which is no longer the default or the commonplace way of communicating. Instead, perhaps we will have our own personal language models fine tuned to us and our backgrounds and idiosyncrasies and everything else, which the moment we begin a sentence, whether by speech or at the keyboard, it will fill in the blanks for us from that point on. And so I think what you've described is certainly a plausible scenario. And in terms of telling the difference, not only am I not optimistic that the technology will get there, I think everything that we've seen so far has been a pretty dismal failure. I also, for reasons I was talking about a few moments ago, I don't know how much I really believe in that mission because it suggests, again, a kind of purity to, or some kind of essentialness of writing and communication that I'm not sure is ever really there. I think it's always elusive and chimerical. And in some ways, what language models have done for us recently is just kind of foregrounded that reality, a reality that's always been in place, that the tools, the technologies, the media, and the machines have always been our silent collaborators.
That's a great phrase. Yeah, I tend to think of it as, it will be all of these other markers of social relationship or social relation to, the text and its
Yes,
origins that'll be the cues, because we're
exactly.
already in that situation, like, is Matt using a ghostwriter?
Hmm.
Yeah, we
Hmm.
already have this sort of conundrum. Is the author sort of thing? And so it's
Yeah,
probably just going to be
yeah.
some sort of an extension of that.
And maybe we'll see novels with stickers on the front cover, 100% authentic, humanly authored prose inside.